Dr. Cara Natterson. Cara is a pediatrician, New York Times bestselling author, and co-founder and CEO of Oomla, a company designed to make puberty more comfortable, literally by creating content and products for tweens and teens. She co-hosts the Puberty podcast, which updates adults on how this transformative stage has changed and how has it changed. And she has recently launched the TikTok channel, Spilling the Puberty Tea. Cara's puberty books include the Care and Keeping of You series, Guy Stuff, and Guy Stuff Feelings, and her latest book, Decoding Boys. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. I'm coming from California where the sun has not gone down yet, but I know it's your evening, so I really appreciate you taking the time. The way I think we'll do this is I'm just going to walk through a really short slide presentation, give you a little overview about puberty, what it is and how it has changed, because it has changed, and then open up the floor for a conversation, because really that's the most helpful thing, is if I can answer the questions that you all have. So let me see if I can get the technology working here. All right. Stacy, you got my slide one up there? Okay, great. So I just want to start by defining a few terms around puberty, because these terms get very confusing, and understanding the language is as important as anything else in this conversation. So let's start at the top with the words puberty and adolescence. So puberty is the sexual maturation from child to adult. So it really is the path from which you become able, through which you become able to reproduce, okay? Adolescence usually encompasses puberty. It's a teenage stage. Now it includes tweens and sometimes 20-somethings. It is all the social, emotional, behavioral, and physical shifts. So you can see here on this little chart that adolescence is this entire section here in the middle, which can be called lots of different things in lots of different places. Some people call them teenagers, some people older adolescents and younger adolescents, some people call them youth, but all of these terms usually span the ages of about 10 to about 25. And adulthood on this graph is marked starting at 18 is when that's supposed to be starting, but we all know that the reason that this bar is so long is that the way the brain works in particular, adulthood probably doesn't start until a bit later. And we'll talk about that in a sec. So that's puberty versus adolescence, okay? We use the terms essentially synonymously now in the greater span of things. And I have the Puberty podcast, and it's not just about puberty, it's about adolescence. So I think it's a very fair thing to use those terms interchangeably, but just so you know what they mean. Gender and chromosomes, another pair of words that often get complicated. So chromosomes, if you remember back to your 8th grade biology days, these are, every single cell has 23 pairs of chromosomes, and they look, this is a cartoonified version, but they look not dissimilar to this under a microscope. The 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. The one on the left is XX, and the one on the right is XY. And that is because when you look at them, one looks like an X and one sort of looks like a Y. And you can kind of just believe me on that one. That is how those were determined. The sex chromosomes are largely in charge of not just our sort of the sex organs and the progression of the maturation of those organs, but also, and we'll talk about this, the moods that go along with maturation of those organs, because the sex chromosomes turn on the hormones that turn on the process of puberty. So when we talk about chromosomal sex, this is what we're talking about, XX and XY. But there's chromosomal sex, and then there's gender. And these are actually very different. And I think today it's very fortunate to live at a moment when there is an appreciation of the difference between these things, because I would argue that when many of us who are on this Zoom were growing up, the difference was not well appreciated. I love this schematic to explain gender and gender terminology. It's from a website called genderbread.org. It kind of walks through, for people who are unfamiliar with how to distinguish gender from chromosomal sex, how it breaks down. So you can see, as we start from top to bottom, that identity, gender identity, is how you actually experience and define your own gender. Attraction is completely separate from identity. That's who you are drawn to or not drawn to in a sexual or romantic way. Your sex in this diagram is chromosomal sex. So it's that last slide that I showed you, X's and Y's. And then on the left side, expression is the way that you present your gender identity and attraction. So it's all sort of, it loops together all three of these concepts. But it is very, we could spend an hour on how gender identity, who you think you are along a spectrum, and then gender expression, how you show who you are, and then biological sex, the equipment that you're born with, and the hormones that influence the way that equipment works, and then attraction, who you're romantically sort of drawn towards and sexually into. We could talk for an hour about how those things are very different and how they intersect. And it's complicated. And one of the through lines of this conversation is going to be conversation. And this is a really great one to have with your kids many, many times. They will teach you a lot about how gender identity and attraction and biological sex are being approached differently in teaching in schools today. Okay, next set of words: parent versus adult influence or non-adult influence. So I used to do a lot of parenting talks. I don't like to call them that anymore, because parents, we know, are the people, but birth parents are the people who are genetically responsible for a child, and then parents are the people who traditionally would raise those children, but the family structure has really changed. And it's not just about who lives under a roof anymore. There are very profound adult influences in our kids' lives. And this is a really important piece of puberty, because you may have adults who are very formative for your kid. It might be an aunt or an uncle. It might be a very close family friend. And that person may become a really healthy substitute for you from time to time, particularly when you get into tricky situations or have a conversation that you're trying to have with your kid and you can't go about it really effectively, and you may pull in that other adult influence. So this concept of parenting, I think, is much broader, and it's really about adult influencing. But then there are non-adult influences. And for those of you with multiple kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because a sibling can be far more powerful in terms of getting another kid in the house to do something or think a certain way. What I say to my two kids, and I have a 16-year-old son and an 18-year-old daughter, what I say is often impactful, but what one of my kids says to the other kid is often much more impactful. So I think we have to think about the non-adult influences as we're talking about puberty. And of course, there are all of these that cross different age barriers. People like coaches can be young and they can be older. Teachers, people who touch your kids' lives on a day-to-day basis are very, very influential. I used to call the talk Surviving and Thriving Through Puberty, and I just put the word survival on here to call attention to the fact that survival through puberty means very different things to different people. And I encourage you to remember that it's all relative, that a bad day in your home may be a very good day in someone else's home. And that there are, especially after COVID, we have had not just an infectious pandemic, but we've also had a mental health pandemic. And this notion of survival through puberty has become very, very real in our world. And so while I'm going to talk to you about things that are very narrow in their scope, I just want to also encourage you to pull the lens back every once in a while, check yourself at the door. Remember that in the big picture, mental health is so critically important. And sometimes when we want to talk about things, or we want to give our kids feedback and their mental health is not there, it's fine. It's fine. We can take a note, and we can do that parenting a little bit later. All right. So quick history about puberty. And I'm going to walk through these stages on different slides, but we're going to start with the old normal. So in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a guy named James Tanner, he's a physician, and he went into orphanages across the UK, post-war orphaned kids, and he did a study that could never be done today. He took pictures of naked kids for 30 years. And the good news is that he used these pictures for good. What he did was he staged the physical development in order to define what was normal. And he looked at breast development, he looked at testicular development, and he looked at hair growth. No one had ever done it. And he was just defining normal. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the study would never be done today. One is the pictures, but the second is that he only took pictures. He never examined the kids. So we have a system of staging puberty, and it's called the Tanner stages, and there are 5 of them, and I'll walk you through them. But that system was based on pictures, and it was based never upon someone actually checking to see, had the testicles really grown, or were there breast buds there? Very limited. Nonetheless, the Tanner stages look something like this. And I wrote this book called The Care and Keeping of You. I actually did not write the original. I did the updated version and then all the rest in the series. And this pair of pages was a very famous 2-page spread in the original book. And it still gets a ton of attention. If you go on TikTok and just put The Care and Keeping, you'll see a lot about these pages. But the Tanner stages are what are listed down at the bottom. So this is breast Tanner staging. Stage 1 is nothing's happening. This is prepubescent. Stage 5 is fully developed adult. So puberty is stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. And in breast development, you see a very clear progression through the stages. Stage 2 is called breast budding, where you just have lumps under the nipples. Stage 3 is, or the tissue starts to grow. Stage 4, the nipples start to separate out. The same staging was done for testicles. The same staging was done for hair. Quick note on staging. Tanner never mentioned that the 2 sides don't talk, and often one side grows before the other. That causes a lot of stress for a lot of kids. The other thing is that he staged breast development and testicular development, which are connected with puberty, but he also staged hair growth. And it turns out that even though hair tends to sprout during puberty, it actually has nothing to do with sexual maturation. It's on a totally different hormonal path. So some kids have hair sprouting very, very young, and they go to the doctor and they're told you're not in puberty. And other kids have hair sprouting much later, and they're worried about it. And just a moment of reassurance that while hair growth tends to be coincidental with puberty, it's really breast growth and testicular growth that we look for to be the first signs of physical puberty. Of course, I have a friend named Louise Greenspan. We'll get to her in a minute. And she says the first sign of puberty is really a slamming door. And we'll talk about that. So in 1997, right? So now we're like 50 years beyond when Tanner first started publishing. There was a nurse who was based in North Carolina. Her name was Marcia Herman Giddens. And she was seeing kids in her clinic, and they were coming in and they were much more developed than they were supposed to be. Because according to Tanner, girls went into puberty at 11. That's when they started developing, and boys at 11 and a half. And she was looking at this population of girls and she's going, there must be something wrong with the girls that I'm seeing. And so she petitioned the American Academy of Pediatrics. She set up a study and she looked at 17,000 girls in several different cities. And what she found was that according to Tanner's stages, and she actually examined them, they were going through puberty a year earlier than Tanner had predicted. So in 50 years, the average age for onset of puberty had moved from 11 to 10. And this was a humongous headline when it hit in April of 1997. And it was everywhere. And it was all about girls. So now flash forward to 2010. In 2010, my friend Louise Greenspan, the one who says that puberty starts with the slamming of the door, she and I actually trained in residency together. And then she went on to study endocrinology, which is hormones, and do all of the studies based out of Kaiser, Northern California, which is one of the largest study centers for puberty. And Louise went to go document whether Marsha Herman Giddens' study was correct. She just wanted to replicate the study. We do that in medicine a lot. And she went to replicate it. And what did she find? Well, she found that puberty was beginning another year earlier. So now between 97 and she started collecting her data in 2005, in just about 12 or 13 years, puberty had moved up another year. And then in 2012, Marsha Herman Giddens said, why is no one looking at boys? And she did. And she found that the story that we were telling about girls was identical for boys. So today, the average age for a girl to enter puberty in this country is between 8 and 9. And the average age for a boy to enter puberty is between 9 and 10. And that is a lot earlier than Tanner had predicted based upon his studies. And Louise has written a fabulous book about it called The New Puberty, which I encourage anyone to read if they're curious as to why. But her short answer is, it's everything. It is the food we eat, it's what we drink, it's the air we breathe, it's the cosmetics that we put into and onto our bodies. And what the common denominators are yet to be determined, but we will find them. But the good news is, as she likes to say, we will not have kindergartners going into puberty in a generation. This has pretty much hit the bottom in terms of how early puberty will start. But when I tell you now that puberty used to run from 11 to about 14, 15, and now it runs from 8 to closer to 17 or 18, it's like taffy. And this is a very, very long process, and it's a lot to handle. So what actually happens in puberty? Well, in the XX body, so the genetic female, the dominant hormone is estrogen. There are lots of hormones that are part of puberty, but the most dominant is estrogen. So estrogen is released from the ovaries. LH and FSH come from your brain, and they tell your ovaries to release estrogen. And estrogen turns on breast growth, and it turns on moods. And the mood impact that you see is not from estrogen itself, but it's from the surges of estrogen, the very quick rises and the very rapid falls of estrogen levels. And over time, the XX bodies develop curves and voice changes, and they get periods, and they have growth spurts, all related to the estrogen surges, okay? And as I said before, on a totally separate path is hair, and along with hair comes zits and body odor. That's all happening at the level of the hair follicle, and that's all governed by hormones that come from the adrenal glands called the adrenal androgens. They're like cousins of testosterone. So they're in the family, but they're not estrogen or testosterone. In the XY body, the dominant hormone is testosterone. So again, you have these hormones, LH and FSH, they come from the brain, they go down to the testicles, and they turn the testicles on, and the testicles make testosterone. So for the first couple of years of boy puberty, all that's happening is the machinery is growing. The testicles and the penis are starting to grow. And this happens during a time when boys tend to get very, very private. So when I tell parents that the average age for boys to go into puberty is between 9 and 10, the most common response I get is, well, not my kid. And what I'm going to tell you is probably your kid, but you are not measuring his testicles, nor should you. Even I did not measure my son's testicles, so none of you should measure yours. And most boys are covering up at that point. And for those who have a nudist, you're very lucky because you know what's going on with your kid, but you don't need to pay a whole lot of attention because you'll see puberty when it really kicks into full gear. So over time, testosterone leads to more lean muscle mass. It causes voice changes because of the way it impacts the vocal cords. Then boys have wet dreams, not all, but most, and their growth spurt as well. And again, separate path is hair, zits, and body odor. So why the moods? We talked about this. It's really the surges. And it's also the fact that blood flows throughout our entire body. So we don't circulate things from the neck down. I think there's this assumption that hormones are only going to impact everything from the neck down, but we all know that hormones make us feel a certain way. The chemical stew is what we call it, that's around the brain, the hormones mixed in with the fluid that bathes the brain and protects it. That chemical stew really impacts the way neurons fire and communicate with one another. And so in the XX body, the brain, when it's surrounded by a lot of estrogen, tends to express moods as outward and loud. Crying, laughing, right? Not always, but often. In the XY body, the stew of testosterone, we know it causes rage. There's a lot written about that, but I'm a big believer that it also causes the flip side of that coin, which is the quiet, which is the slamming door, the monosyllabic, the I don't want to talk to you or engage with you, quiet. And again, not always, but often. A quick note about brain development, which this is the only image you can pull from the internet on PET scans of the brain. If you Google that, you'll see 300 versions of this, and all of them are low resolution, so I apologize. But what it's meant to show you, and it's an old slide, and I'll show you why, but what it's meant to show you is on the left side is a 5-year-old brain, on the right side is a 20-year-old brain. And what it's measuring is the balance between white matter and gray matter in the brain. So naked neurons in the brain are gray. Think of a naked neuron like a wire, like a phone charger wire that has no plastic wrapping. So if it sends an impulse and something else touches it, it gets a shock, right? If you touch a naked wire, you're going to get a shock, right? Because it's not insulated. And the message travels very slowly. But in an insulated wire, like your phone charger cord that has a nice rubber coating, the message travels really quickly and you can touch it and there's no transmission of the impulse. Well, the brain insulates the nerves in the brain over time. And that's what that transition from gray to white is. It's the building of an insulation layer. And the parts of the brain that are the most insulated send messages the most quickly. So you'll hear a lot about the prefrontal cortex, which is all the way out here under the forehead. And that's the part of the brain that makes really smart, good, consequential decisions, right? It's the thoughtful CEO of the brain. And it's there. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's not myelinated. It's not covered with this nice insulation until kids are, this is where this image is wrong, 25 or 30, okay? Meanwhile, the myelin, the insulation layer has gone from the bottom to the top and the inside out. So it's hit the bottom and the middle of the brain by the time kids are in middle school. Well, what's in the middle of the brain? The emotional center of the brain. That's where the limbic system is, the amygdala, the parts of the brain where it feels good to do something, you're going to do that thing. You want to take a risk because there's a reward. It's not all negative stuff, by the way. I think we've demonized it, but it's definitely the more impulsive part of the brain. And that's what sends and receives signals the fastest in middle school and in high school and in college. And it takes until kids are in their mid to late 20s before the really rational prefrontal cortex is as insulated as the rest of the brain and can send and receive messages as quickly. And for those of you who are on this Zoom who have a kid who always makes good decisions, then I challenge you to think, has that kid made really smart decisions quickly and impulsively? Because usually the answer is no. Usually what those kids are doing is giving their brain time to send the signal to the prefrontal cortex. And so one really good parenting tip is that if all you teach your kid is to count to 10 before they make a decision that they're not sure about, you've done a great job teaching your kid how to fight impulse, because the message has time to get to the prefrontal cortex. So some strategies for helping people survive and thrive through puberty. And this is stuff that parents or any adult influence can use during this transformational stage. And they're pretty simple. So the first one is to talk. And what that means is you can have a verbal conversation. You can also have a texting conversation. You can also exchange a journal. You can communicate with your kid in whatever way works for your kid at the time. And some kids get really quiet, particularly boys, typically. And so those talks may be shorter, but there are going to be many, many, many of them. And so if your child knows that conversation is always available to them, then they know that they don't just have a one-off chance. I always tell people that when I used to see patients in my pediatric practice, I would often ask teenagers and their parents if they had ever had conversations about sex. And the teenagers would say no. They would say unequivocally, absolutely no, my parents do not talk to me about that. And then I would, while the kids were getting dressed or whatever, I'd pull the parents aside and I'd say, hey, have you ever had a conversation with your kid about sex? Oh my God, absolutely. And they could tell me every detail of the conversation they had with their kid. And so one talk doesn't always land. It might be important to you, but it's not necessarily important to your kids. So talking means many talks many times. But it's as important to listen as it is to talk. And in fact, if all you do is talk, it's what I'm doing right now. It's a lecture. It's a one-way monologue. And that is not helpful. So as you open up conversations, I encourage you to get comfortable with the silence and to give your kid time and space to actually be able to speak and say something, which is easier said than done. The third tip is to what I call take the do-over. And it's literally the best piece of advice I can give you, which is you're going to do something, make a rule, give your kid something, whatever it is, and you regret it. It was the wrong call. That's fine. Just say to your kid, I am taking a do-over. I gave you that phone. I let you go on that app. I let you go to that party, whatever. I'm going to take it back because I'm not ready for this or you're not ready for this, but we can have a conversation around it and let them understand it's not a never, it's just a not now. And if you take do-overs with them, what it's modeling for them is that they can take do-overs in life, which is really, really important because not every decision has to be in cement. And then the last thing is to call the right person for help when you're in over your head. So it's really important to have a mental list of people who are your go-to people. That might include your pediatrician. It might include your best friend. It might include a parent, your parent. It might include another parent. It should be a list that's longer than one person. And it should, as your kids get older, be a list that your kid is aware of so that they know who the right surrogate for you is, because there is going to be something they can't talk to you about. There is going to be something that they think they're going to be in terrible trouble for, or they're just not going to necessarily agree with what you have to say. And if you have identified for them a safe person to go to, they shockingly will go to that person most of the time. And if that person is a safe person and knows your kid is coming, if they don't know your kid is coming, that can be a little tricky for them. So just let them know. But talking, listening, taking do-overs, and calling the right people for help, that will get you all through a period that I wish was seamless, but it's just not. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome questions and comments. And Stacy, I think you're going to organize that.
I am. Thank you, Cara. The one thing is that we forgot. Cara had a TikTok that she showed me in the beginning that is that might be something to show our audience tonight. It'll give you a good laugh. So here we have a question that came in. My 8th grade daughter has a girlfriend who just told her that she is bisexual and likes her. Can an 11-year-old understand? Sorry, I need my cheaters. What bisexual really means? How should my daughter manage this? This is 5th grade.
Yeah. So it's a wonderful question because it brings up a couple of different things. The first is what kids know and when, and then sort of the language that they have versus the conceptual understanding that they have. So the average age for first porn viewing in this country is 11 for males, and it's not much later for females. The studies say 14 or 15, but those are old studies, and that's not accurate. It's much closer to about 12 or 13 for females. And the reason why is because the pornographers are finding our kids. They really want kids to become paying customers over time. And so they're targeting them with their content. So I start the answer this way because if you think that your fifth grader does not know anything about sex, you're wrong. Unfortunately, what a fifth grader knows is what someone else wants them to know. And so it is very important for parents, I think, and for the adult influences in a kid's life to take ownership of conversations around sex and sexuality, because if you don't, someone else is going to have those conversations with your kid. And I don't know that they're going to share with your kid what you want to be sharing with your kid. So what do kids know about sex by the fifth grade? Well, they do know a lot about sexual identity. And they know a lot about it because the terminology is in the mainstream. So they understand what heterosexual is, what homosexual is, what bisexual is. They understand what pansexual is. They understand an acronym list that you don't understand. And I would challenge you to ask your kids to teach you the language and the terminology, because you will learn something from them. But mostly what you will learn is they often know the words, but they don't understand the meaning behind the words. And that's where it's so valuable to have these conversations with them. So a child may know what bisexual means because they've heard the term, but they don't really understand what it means. And that is not just one conversation, right? That's a lot of conversations with your kid and unpacking information slowly over time. The other thing I would say is it's very normal for kids to have crushes in the starting around the fourth or fifth grade. In fact, that's probably one of the other early signs of puberty as hormones are starting to flow. Certain urges are starting to appear, and it's almost always the girls who, right, their puberty is happening a little bit earlier. So that some of their crushes and their sexual feelings are starting a little bit earlier than some of the boys, not all, but many. And so the expression of that, it's also really important to kind of normalize and not demonize, but also teach limits. Consent is a really, really important conversation. And there are lots of ways consent looks and feels. And sometimes consent refers to how much someone shares about what they're thinking or feeling. And so teaching your kid how to respond to someone who's just sharing a feeling becomes really important. And it's going to be different in every family. You know, there are lots of squares on this Zoom, and every square is going to respond to that question slightly differently, and that's fine. I'd say, you know, if I could give you one piece of advice, it's to not judge anyone else's approach. Just you do you and focus on what works in your family. But that being said, have tremendous empathy, right? So approach, if a fifth grader is sharing feelings, whether or not they are returned, which is sort of beside the point, it is really important to begin with empathy for the child who's sharing their feelings, empathy for your child who might feel that they're in a little bit of an awkward position. But if we take judgment out and we take sort of the demonization of kids or parents out, it makes for a much easier conversation.
Thank you, Cara. We have another question here that asks, what is the right age to start talking to my children about sex, sexual identity, etc.?
Yeah. So if the average age for a boy viewing porn is fifth grade, and by the way, they don't have to have their own device, right? They can just have a login onto a platform. It's really easy. So if you have not given a child a phone or an iPad or what have you before then, that's great. But having the device is not necessary in order to have all the imagery. But if I tell you the average age is fifth grade, then I'm also going to answer that you having the conversation before fifth grade is ideal. The problem is some kids aren't ready for it, right? So again, lots of squares on this Zoom, and Some of the squares are filled with kids who are very curious and want the information. And some are filled with families where the kids, they aren't ready. And it's complicated because you live in a world where it's there and it may find them, and yet you're trying to engage them in a conversation they don't want to have. And so this is really going to depend on how things set up in your family. But my best suggestion is, if you have a child who is not yet in 5th grade, I would start by asking questions and trying to sort of prompt where they are. You can ask if they've heard about sex, or you can just tell them, I'm always here and I would love to be the one to give you information about this. You can give them, what I did with my kids is I sort of laid out a scenario in which, I'm like, when you're ready, I want to be the person to give you information because I'm going to give you good information. So you don't have to look at me. You can do this any which way you want. You can write me a note and tell me you're ready. You can turn off all the lights. You don't have to look at me. I gave them all these different scenarios. And what was interesting is, in my own home, and this is what I do for a living, it was my younger child who asked first. And when my older child, who was in the 4th or 5th grade, wasn't asking, I went to her and I said, I feel like your little brother just asked a question that he's a little young for, but I think you actually need to know the answer to. And that was the way in through the conversation. And the other thing is, if you have a kid coming to you asking for information about sex, the most important response, the first response, is, that's such an interesting question. What made you think of it? Because you need to gauge where your kid is. You might have a child who's asking for a very specific detail. You might have a child who's asking a very big, broad question. You don't want to go down one road answering the question when that's not the question they're asking at all. So it's a very powerful way to pause and figure out where your kid is to ask them that. Now, if you have a kid who's older than 5th grade and you have not yet had this conversation, please do not panic. You have not missed your opportunity. It's not like you've ruined this. It's just a good reminder that it's probably time. And so sort of get your ball rolling. And some people start by asking about other kids. Do you have friends who watch porn, or do you have friends who have talked about sex? If your kids ride the bus is the source of all information. So if they ride the bus, they know about sex by the time they're in about 5th or 6th grade. So you can engage your kid without judgment, without any accusation. If you have a much older kid, if you have a middle schooler, a 7th, 8th, even a 9th grader, and you've never had these conversations, I'd go in really calm and really straight up. Hey, I've never had this conversation with you. I'm realizing it's time. So do you want to tell me what you know? Or I can ask you questions. What's going to work here? And if the door gets slammed, which it might, you just go back and try again another time, because it's the persistence and the constant reminder that you really want to be able to help your kid and educate your kid that is the most important piece of all this.
Great. Thank you, Cara. This kind of ties into what you're saying. So if you try to have a conversation about sexuality and your child tells you, I don't want to talk about this right now, it's making me uncomfortable, I really don't want to know that, what would be a good way to deal with these types of responses?
Yeah. So two steps. The first is to respect the fact that they're ending the conversation, because some kids will just leave. They really will. And it's not meant as a sign of disrespect. They just don't want to. They're shutting down. They don't want to be in this conversation. So the first thing that you can say is, I hear you. I hear you and I understand. And you can then say, but even though I'm going to respect what you want now, I really need to know over time that you have good information, because information is going to protect you. So I'm going to come back around and ask you again. I don't know when, but I'm going to keep asking you until you're ready to have the conversation. And if you ever want to come to me, we can do it that way too. And just lay it out. You're not mad. You're not disappointed. You just have a kid who's not ready. Follow through. Go back in a couple of days or a week, when you're prompted by seeing some bus drive down with some crazy inappropriate advertisement on the side, when you're watching TV together and a scene comes up and you're like, oh boy, here we go. We never had that sex conversation. Circle back with your kid and say, remember when I said I'm going to come back and ask? I'm coming back and asking again. And you could get shut down 17 times. For those of you who remember starting new foods with your babies, they can spit out the new food how many times before they finally decide they like it? The same is true of conversations around tricky topics. But if you establish yourself as someone who really means it, and you're not demanding, you're just there and you're open to have the conversation, they will eventually not just come back and talk to you, but really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. I love all these questions. They're great questions. Keep them coming. So when you're having the chat about sexuality, what are, let's say, the top 5 bullet points you actually address? Sex, sex identity, feelings. What do you address first? What does that look like?
Yes, I mean, all of it, right? So just like there's no one way through puberty, there's no one way through conversations about sex and sexuality. So it usually works better to address something that's relevant in the moment. I don't know if you ever have this experience, but I often have an experience where I realize there's something I really want to talk about with my kids, but it's my agenda and it's on my timing. And I show up in the middle of something else that's going on, and I just drop this bomb of information into the middle of, they're doing something totally different. It has no resonance for them. When that happens, when we do that, the conversation doesn't really land. So you're better served by taking the teachable moment when the teachable moment comes up. If, like I said, if there's a show, if there's a song with lyrics and you're listening to the lyrics and you're like, wait a second, we have to have a conversation around this. That's a great way in. But you have to cover it all. So definitions of sex. Kids need to understand the different types of sex, and they do need to understand what safe sex is. Consent. That is not a one-way, one gender conversation. I think our girls somehow think that they do not have to get consent. They do, just like the boys do. So consent is huge. Respect. Okay, respect for other people's feelings, respect for other people's bodies. So much of the training ground of conversations around sex can be conversations around periods, right? How do we want classmates to look out for someone who might have gotten their period and they don't know, right? You want to have the kid who hands someone a sweatshirt, the kid who hands someone a pad and says, they got you covered, just meet me in the bathroom, right? Well, all those concepts translate over into conversations about sex as well, looking out for other people, making sure that the relationship and the dynamic between them and someone else feels safe, making sure they have a buddy. These are all conversations around sex, right? Then there are conversations about sexual logistics. And, it's funny, my kids have, now that they're older teenagers, have started asking me very specific questions about, they want to understand, when is pain expected and when is it not okay? How do you know if something's wrong? These are questions that you want your kids to be able to come to you and ask you. So all of it is on the table, and all of it does need to be covered over the years. Probably the most effective way of addressing it is listening. And when you hear a story that they're telling about a friend is always a great way in the door. You can flip it and say, what if it was you?
Great, thank you. So the next question is about books. Are there any books you would recommend we can use as a guide when talking about sex for the first time with a 9 or 10-year-old girl? And are there books you recommend regarding sexuality for a 10-year-old? And I think that one, correct me if I'm wrong, if you sent this to me, that seemed to me meaning for a 10-year-old to read. So please just let me know in the chat if I'm reading that the right way.
So there is an author named Roby Harris who wrote probably the most well-known books about sex. One's called It's Not the Stork, one's called It's So Amazing. And these are cartoony graphic novels that walk through sex and basic sex information. I love them. They're a bit old school. They do not encompass gender diversity, or they do not look at a broad cross-section of different sexualities. They're very much sort of teaching the reproductive cycle, and they're old school in that way. But I think they have tremendous benefits. There are also other books that, and I forgive me because I don't have the list at the top of my head, but they're really, really good sites that you can go to look them up, about sort of the broad variety of different types of sexual relationships. And I think it's really actually very important to put those books into the general circulation of what your kid is reading. Roby Harris books are designed for kids to read. I always suggest that parents read the books first and then hand them to their kids. And then you can sort of springboard your conversation. So you don't have to start from square one when you're talking about something. You can say, hey, remember that page with that picture? Okay, let's talk about that. And you've already kind of gotten over the awkwardness of entering the conversation because you have common ground where you've read a book and they've read a book. For older kids, there are also a lot of really wonderful books. There's one called SEX that's excellent, that just walks through a lot of basic logistics around sex, safe sex, a whole bunch of sexual diversity topics, but that's squarely for older teenagers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Questions keep coming. I'm trying to keep them all straight. Okay, so my girls started a new school this year. They went from a small private Catholic school to a large public middle school. They are meeting and making friends with very different kids than prior years. Several of these kids have different genders from their chromosomal sexes and different expressions of it. Two friends of my one daughter are 2 years older than her. They're in 8th grade. The one boy does cosplay and is overtly expressing himself with wigs, female clothing, etc. I don't object to his presentation of himself, but I'm just not sure if my daughter is too young to be friends with him. I think she really admires his flamboyance and his freedom of personal expression, which is so different from anyone at her previous school. How do I handle this?
Yeah. It's a really fair question, because I think ultimately what parents want to know is, how do I honor my kid so that child can be who they want to be, versus how do I protect my kid from going down a road of almost feeling pressured to experiment with fill in the blank, right? Today it's gender expression. Another day it might be drugs. Another day it might be something else. And the answer is that having friends who look and behave a whole variety of ways is only going to create an environment of tolerance and welcoming for your kids if you're having conversations with your kids about honoring who they truly are too. So I'm a big fan of opening the conversation regularly about sort of, who do you think you are, and what do you want, and what do you hope to be, and helping kids build their own identity so that when they have a very diverse peer group, they honor and respect their peers, but they don't feel like they necessarily need to try on different personas all the time. Now, middle school in particular is a time to try on different personas. That's the reality of it. So some of your kids will go through stages that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Some of them will play with identities. I always use goth as the example because that was sort of the classic one when I was growing up. The kids who went through a stage where that was really how they chose to express themselves. When you talk to them now, some of them were doing it because they were influenced by another peer. Others of them were doing it just to see if their parents were going to respond. They were out there going, parents, I want to talk to you about who I am. And the parents, the more the kids did that, the more the parents pulled back because they did not know how to manage it. So if you find yourself in a situation where your kid is trying on different personalities and it's making you feel nervous or uncomfortable, get some help. Bring someone into the conversation who can help you find your comfort and help you talk to your kid. And that's a therapist who knows what they're doing. So you want to get a good referral from either your pediatrician or a school counselor, about someone who can help you navigate those conversations. Because sometimes the conversations are bigger than what we are able to handle, or we don't have the tools. We were not raised with quite as much diversity around us in all these different directions.
Great, thank you, Cara. So the next question is, how do you start to explain porn to a fifth grader who you don't think has been exposed to it?
Oh my God, I get that question a lot, and it's really hard. Like, you don't want to introduce when kids are like 3, right? And they're afraid to go to bed because there's a monster. The last thing you want to do is say, I'm going to look in your closet and make sure the monster is not there, because they've never thought of the monster being in the closet. They were just afraid of a generic monster, right? You've just introduced a whole new idea to them. The monster now lives in their closet. You can apply that exact same thing to porn. Like, if you've got the fifth grader who's in the 50% who's never seen it, who doesn't have a friend who showed it to them, and who hasn't been targeted on social media apps, well then, are you opening a Pandora's box by having a conversation about it? Are you creating something for them that they were, or sort of creating a worry or a fear or an anxiety when they were never going to be exposed for another fill in the blank year, 2 years, what have you? I do think there's a middle ground, right? So I think it's really, really important to talk about porn in the context of consent. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. The first is, kids have cameras around them at all times. And so for them to understand when they are consenting to having an image taken of them and when they aren't, and when they are consenting to have an image sent or posted and when they aren't, is a very important preamble conversation to the porn conversation. And it might seem like it's too disjointed, but let me walk you through it. So if you have conversations with your kid around the appropriate use of images and when it's okay to share an image of yourself or not, and frankly, when it's okay for you to share an image of them or not, right? Now you can toe into a conversation about pictures with clothes and without clothes. And it's the rare fifth grader who has not heard of nudes or even been asked to send a nude, even though kids sometimes don't even know what they're asking for when they ask another kid to send a nude. But a conversation about what is a nude and when is it okay to send a picture of someone naked is actually a really, really important first step before the porn conversation. Because then you can combine the two threads and you can talk about how, there are privacy issues and there are consent issues around nude images. And then they're sort of, what would that person want, or what am I ready for? And as you weave all these things together, you can end up having a conversation about porn without your kid realizing and without your kid feeling like you're jamming a conversation that they're not ready for. So the conversation might go something like, hey, I've heard this speaker tonight, and they're talking about how kids trade pictures all the time on their phones. And of course, this has been going on forever, but like, I just want to make sure, you know that it's not okay. And actually, it's not even legal to take a picture with no clothes on. I mean, do you know that? Have you had that conversation with anyone? Do you know that? And then you can stop there. And then if they say yes, you can ask them what they know. And if they say no, you can say, oh yeah, that's there's this thing called child pornography. And if there are pictures of kids that are unclothed that are being exchanged, that's actually, it's against the law. I just want to let you know. And then you can stop there. And now the word pornography is out there. And for about 50% of those kids, they'll come back and they'll go, well, I've heard of porn, but that's not what I've heard about porn. I've heard something totally different about porn. Now they open the door to that conversation. And if they don't come back, and by the way, it is true that nudes are the creation of child porn, and that sending nudes is the trafficking of child porn. And it's a huge hot button issue. And I strongly suggest that you look into it if you haven't had conversations about it before. But then you can toe into the conversation about seeing other people naked. And that is a very good first step into a pornography conversation, just about seeing other people naked and what is and isn't comfortable in your home. I want to make a book suggestion for you on this front. There's a book called What They Don't Teach Your Teens by a guy named Jonathan Crystal. It's for older kids, it's for high schoolers, but parents and high schoolers should read it. And it walks through the sort of the legal implications of a whole series of things that are really not explicitly taught. And nudes is a huge section in the book, and it's really, really helpful. Another one is, when can someone demand your phone? When can they take your phone from you? And it turns out they can't. So becomes actually very important for kids to understand what their legal rights are. Middle school, too young, but high school, it's an excellent book.
Thank you, Cara. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, and we've just rounded out to our hour program. So if anyone has any last minute questions, you can put it in quickly. Otherwise, I did already put our survey into the chat, and I really would appreciate it if you take a moment or two just to fill it out. I, for one, know I learned a lot from you, Cara. Always fun to see you and talk to you. And we thank you all for joining us. And I know Cara mentioned a couple books, and some people asked to put them in the chat. And what I'd like to do, Cara, if that's okay, we can talk offline, and you will all receive an email with the recording, and I'll also put the book list in as well.
And I'll also do a plug for, I do a podcast called the Puberty Podcast, and we cover a lot of these topics, and we'll continue to roll out more and more every week. It's worth scrolling through. Kids can listen. It's really designed more for adult listeners, but we don't ever say anything in there because there's really nothing to say that your kids can't also hear. So we try to say it in a way that kids can also digest it.
Great, thank you. Cara, if you have one quick last question, is that okay? If you have to sign off, that's okay.
No, go for it.
Okay, so one last question is, what about checking your kid's phone or iPad, Discord or social media for content to see if it's appropriate? How do we deal with privacy versus keeping them safe?
Yeah, it's a great way to end. So one of the many conversations that I encourage you to have with your kids is where the line is between privacy and safety. And especially for kids who are under the age of 13, you can use the COPA law, which does not allow companies to share kids' data. So that is a law that you can use as a parent to fall back on to say, you know, it is, you are not supposed to be on X, Y, and Z platforms because they cannot guarantee your privacy. Therefore, if they cannot guarantee your privacy, they cannot guarantee your safety. My job is to keep you safe and healthy. That is your whole job. You're raising a kid, their whole job is to keep them safe and healthy. And so in order to keep you safe and healthy, I'm going to be taking a look. I don't just give you this device blindly, or I don't just give you this login blindly. The deal is I check. And they'll say, for how long? And you'll say, till I'm ready to not check. And I will tell you, it will depend on your kid. And multiple kids in the house will end up having different rules because those different kids will have different personalities and temperaments, and they will push limits differently. It is your job to put up the guardrails. They feel safer. I am telling you, even though they push back and tell you to put down the guardrails, when they know you're randomly taking a peek and looking, they feel safer. And so don't sort of mistake their frustration with you for their feelings of gratitude, right? They've got both, but they are grateful that you are looking. And when you feel that they've hit a point where you don't need to look so much anymore, I also promise you they will push the limits too far and you'll need to start looking again and you'll take your do-over. So it's this dance, right?